Alright, so startups are very counterintuitive, and I'm not sure exactly why.
The founders of Airbnb did not graduate from Stanford or Harvard. They did not have the insider connections in Silicon Valley, and they were working on a startup in the worst financial time in America since the Great Depression. In this video, we're going to talk about the incredible story of Airbnb, which not only lifted their founders from rags to billionaire status, but transformed the Silicon Valley blueprint of how startups became real companies forever. So buckle up, as you'll learn about how to start a startup when you don't have a pedigree, when the odds are stacked against you and the whole world thinks you'll fail. Brian Chesky walked into the room with Joe Gebbia. He was anxious but clear. This was it. This was what they had been waiting for. Brian explained the idea. People are willing to let strangers live in their homes for a good deal, and the hosts as well as the guests are all for it. Paul Graham replied, "Are people really doing this? Why? What's wrong with them? That is crazy." With the power of hindsight, we now know that Airbnb is a massive idea. But how did Brian Chesky and team stumble upon it? And how did they know this would amount to something substantial? Brian Chesky met Joe Gebbia at Rhode Island School of Design. They instantly hit it off. And by the time they graduated, Joe was so confident about this friendship that he went on to talk about how they would build a successful company together. After graduation, Brian went to his first job after college in Los Angeles as an industrial designer where he would work for a year. And after the year was up, Joe thought it was time. He called Brian and said, "Let's start that company we were talking about." Brian up and quit his job, moved to San Francisco with Joe to work on a big idea they didn't even have yet. He had $1,000 in the bank, and his share of the rent was $1,150. He had to make some form of income fast. There was an international design conference in town which they were attending, and they found that all the hotels were booked. To make a nice side income, Brian asked Joe if he could rent out airbeds to some of the people in the conference looking for a room. Brian called it the Airbed and breakfast service for people. The seemingly not so big idea at the time, airbedandbreakfast.com was born. The Trough of Sorrow. I want to ask you, are you willing to fail? Are you willing to be vulnerable, to put what you create out there for the world to get honest feedback on? Airbnb failed again and again and again. Build it and they'll come, right? Just push that iPhone restaurant app idea you have on the iOS store, and that's basically it. Wait for money to print once you turn on ads. Well, that's not exactly how startups work, nor do they work with elaborate business plans. The first thing people think of doing is rent an office, buy a copier machine, print out business cards, buy a domain name, and purchase an email subscription. None of the successful startups followed this approach. In fact, they first tested out if they had built something people want, and then started doing any of these things. After the conference, Brian and Joe understood that there was a need for people to look for affordable travel accommodation options. I mean, it was 2008. Everyone was looking for a cheaper short stay. Even executives were willing to sleep on air mattresses for $80 a night. The design conference, though, just yielded 3 customers for Brian and Joe. They would try again. This time, they aimed to launch at the South by Southwest conference at Texas. Joe thought, well, if Twitter and Foursquare would take off here, why not us? Joe had also managed to convince his friend Nate Blacharsek to work on this together, who was a computer science grad. The design conference story convinced Nate to join and build out Airbnb's first website. They managed to get just 6 listings in time for the conference. However, only 2 guests even booked the listings. One of them was Brian. Brian was demoralized. This would be just their first taste of failure and struggle. Obama cereals. Obama would unknowingly change the trajectory of Airbnb for years to come, and here's how it went down. The year was 2008, and the candidacy of Obama was shaking up the country with every conference he attended, bringing thousands of people to hear him talk. In the summer of 2008, there was going to be a massive Democratic convention in Denver, Colorado, where 100,000 people were expected to arrive, but only 30,000 rooms were available to accommodate them. The founders thought that the Denver event would be a turning turning point in the history of Airbnb. Denver's mayor was planning to convert the city's park to campers. Brian thought this would be a great opportunity to test out another airbed and breakfast launch. This time, the idea would be slightly different. Make it a travel site, accommodate online payments, and let hosts accept guest bookings. They somehow managed to get some press with a CNN interview. It helped get them 100 bookings and 800 homes on the website, and they thought this had to be their launch pad. Reality is stranger than fiction, isn't it? After it gets bad, sometimes it gets worse. Excited with the recent growth in bookings, they went to Silicon Valley for raising venture capital. They contacted 20 investors, 10 replied to their email, only 5 met them, and none of them invested in them. The consensus of investors was, oh well, this is not a big enough market. Strangers living in your home, what type of liability the company that sets this up would have to face? The early investors of Google, PayPal, and Facebook had rejected them. It was heartbreaking to feel there was no investor validation for their idea. 2008 was the worst year for him, as Joe would describe later. Despite their spike in bookings, the founders had maxed out their credit cards and were now $30,000 in debt. Brian would wake up in the morning heart pounding, thinking where would the money come from that day? He knew they had 2 options, sink or swim. The popularity of Obama gave them an idea. What if they focused on the breakfast part of Airbed and Breakfast for now? They designed these cereal boxes for Obama and McCain, calling them Obama O's, the breakfast of change, and Captain McCain, a maverick in every bite. They printed hundreds of these boxes with the help from a fellow RISD grad and hand-sealed them with a hot glue gun at home. They literally pulled a rabbit out of the hat as they managed to sell the $4 cereals for $40 a pop and climbed out of debt by selling $30,000 worth of cereal. Reminds me of that Andy Dufresne moment where he crawled out of a shit tunnel as long as a football field to escape from prison. They didn't know it yet, but the cereals would change their lives. Y Combinator. 3 failed launches, 5 VC rejections, calluses on their hands from the gluing of $30,000 worth of boxes. Now they had to convince Paul Graham they were worth it. Y Combinator was funded by Paul Graham when he sold his company via web for about $50 million in 2003. He did something no one else was doing at the time: own a small piece of a company, give that small but significant initial velocity to a startup so that it gets the launchpad to understand users and get the ball rolling. YC went on to help accelerate massive companies like Reddit, Dropbox, and Twitch. In 2008, YC had made a name for itself, and if you got in, you maybe didn't have the 99% chance of failure that startups are supposed to have. Brian and Joe had somehow managed to get their foot in the door.
The first question Paul Graham asked me is, people are actually doing this? Like staying in each other's homes? And I said, yes. So the second question was, well, what's wrong with them? The interview kind of went downhill from there.
At the end of the interview, almost instinctively, Joe handed a cereal box to Paul, who thought it was possibly a gift.
And Paul Graham said, if you can convince people to pay $40 for a $4 box of cereal, maybe you can convince strangers to stay in other strangers' homes. And he also liked us because he said we were cockroaches. And he said, it's an investment, nuclear winter, and the only people that will survive are cockroaches, and you're a cockroach.
Being called a cockroach was the best compliment Brian could have in present circumstances.
And I remember calling my mom, like, Mom, I'm a cockroach, I got in.
Do 100 people love you? How do you go from getting some initial funding to actually making your company work? Funding is no guarantee that your startup will be successful. Brian knew this well, and this is what he would do. Paul Graham would change the Airbnb's trajectory one more time. He said something which was not common advice at the time. He told Brian, you want 100 people to love you, not 1 million people to like you. If 1 million people like you, that's not going to be enough for your company to win. But if 100 people love you, they will tell 100 more people, and they will tell 100 more, and so on and so on. Brian and the founders went to the customers, lived with them, understood their problems firsthand. They quickly figured out that the photos that were posted of the Airbnbs weren't aesthetic and would not attract customers to make bookings. Brian borrowed a camera from a friend in Brooklyn, shot the photos of some Airbnb listings himself. He knew this was an unscalable task, which he kept doing for customers in New York. This was against the Silicon Valley advice, and more in the terms of Paul Graham's advice, do things that don't scale. And it worked. They started getting customers in every listing. Business grew, and they understood that the quality of listing photos would be a key metric going forward. They made it a priority for Airbnb posts to have good pictures going forward. People visiting New York were from everywhere. They would come to New York, live in Airbnbs, and love the home experience. They liked it so much, they themselves applied to become hosts when they went back. 100 people loved Airbnb and told 100 other people about it. This was the initial traction Airbnb was looking for. Paul had told Brian about ramen profitability in 3 months, which meant the company would need to have enough money for the founders to live on ramen by Demo Day. Demo Day is the culmination of the YC Accelerator program, where the who's who of Silicon Valley decide if you're worth it or not. Come Demo Day, Airbnb managed to scrape through to ramen profitability. They raised $600,000, and this is when Airbnb would transform into a company from a scrappy startup. Economies of scale. Brian now had more than the $30,000 he was working with, but would now have to worry about Airbnb's growth rate and scaling. How would his team get the world to use Airbnb? They doubled down on PR, talked to TechCrunch, Wired, and other news outlets to get the word out. It made a big difference to their growth early on, apart from word of mouth, which they were now getting. They had some local travel agency partners. They went to conferences and concerts. Brian also innovated the way tech companies scaled. Airbnb founders would actually travel to different cities where they had users and talk about the product and give them advice on how they could attract more customers and generate more revenue. Airbnb also had a way for hosts to share their Airbnb listings on Craigslist through a push of a button. Craigslist canceled this feature eventually, of course. Apart from that, they did the usual Facebook and Google ads. Brian understood that Airbnb had not just changed the template of how startup in Silicon Valley took off, but also why Airbnb created a new revolution. They would also do many things in the future, like fighting lawsuits with the New York Attorney General, innovating how company offices were designed, and just executing flawlessly to scale to the next level. Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia went from $30,000 in debt, selling cereals, taking pictures for customer listings themselves, to scaling to $8 billion in revenue today and becoming one of the most valuable companies in Silicon Valley. I would like to know what your favorite startup or company story is. Do let us know in the comments below.